All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Gianluca Stringini. I'm an assistant professor in the EC department here at BU. And today I'm chairing this session, which is focused around modeling of harmful online behavior. I think this is a very important problem, and it's a problem in which computer science and data science can really help as well as get benefit from other disciplines. And it's what I've been doing research on in the last few years. So I start as a computer security person, and then somehow I fell into this rabbit hole, and I started studying online hate and bullying, disinformation, all these kind of problems, and this is where I am. So today I put together a group of people from a variety of disciplines, and you will hear from them in a few minutes. And the goal is really to understand how we can help each other actually mitigating and making essentially the web as well as our society a better place. So what are we talking about? Well, there are a number of harmful activities that are going on, and these are not new problems. These are problems that have been happening since forever. We're talking about fraud, cybercrime, well, traditional crime, online hate, bullying, radicalization, human trafficking, disinformation, and problems like that. The issue is that the internet has greatly facilitated all these problems, right? So these are problems that have been happening forever, and scholars from various disciplines have been studying them forever. But now the internet kind of changed the game. So it basically made it easier to reach victims. It made the scale of these problems much broader, and it also made it more difficult to understand what's going on. Because basically on the internet, everything we see, we kind of need to take at face value, right? So if you see a message, a news article, or whatever it might be, you either have to trust it or you don't. You have no idea of where it came from and so on, unless doing some research in the background. So the problem here, at least from my point of view, is that the research community at the moment lacks computational tools to actually properly measure and model all these activities, okay? So we don't have good computational tools that allow us to trace this information at scale. In my group, then, I develop approaches to basically automatically measure, model, and trace these online harmful activities. And in particular, these approaches can be used to identify emerging information campaigns, what are influential actors, what are communities, and so on. And this understanding is fundamental to develop effective countermeasures. So right now, think about the 2016 election. We've been talking a lot about disinformation, election meddling, all these kind of things. What we've been doing is trying to figure out what happened, but we didn't have good measures of what were actually the important things that happened, what were the important campaigns, what was their effect, and so on. And this is extremely important because this can actually inform researchers from other fields, other disciplines, and help them identify where to dig deeper. So, statistical methods, data science, and so on can help us identify important elements, important case studies to look at. And then we can actually use expertise from 30, 40, 50 years of research in the social sciences and other areas to actually analyze in depth what's going on, but make sure that we are looking at the right problem, at the right case studies. Okay? So this is kind of what I'm doing, and this can also help proving or disproving theories from various fields of scholarship. Okay? So in this session, I will first give you an overview of a couple of things that I've been doing. And then, we will have people from other areas actually tell us what they've been doing. And then we'll conclude with a Q&A and a small panel to basically discuss, what are the opportunities and the challenges that we see in working together, and, what do we hope to achieve by collaborating, okay? So a big challenge that we have when we are trying to measure the internet is that we have all these services where information gets shared, and think about social networks, think about news websites, think about other type of media sites, YouTube, Twitch, email, Instagram, and so on and so forth. A lot of research, or actually most of the research in this field, has only focused on a single service at a time and on a single type of information at a time, okay? So if you look at all research, well, most research on this information, it focuses on Twitter, a little bit on Reddit, but it basically looks at them separately. But actual information is fluid. Information flows across services. And it's possible that there is a disinformation campaign that starts on a certain service and then flows to another one. It is possible that there is a harassment campaign that is orchestrated by a community, let's say 4chan or some sub-community in Reddit and so on, and then goes and targets people on YouTube or goes and targets people on Instagram and so on. By looking at single services at a time, we miss all this context. So we might find that there is a disinformation campaign going on that suddenly pops out of nowhere on Twitter. And if we don't know that actually this organically developed on a different platform, or it evolved from different platforms and so on, we come to the wrong conclusions. Okay? So it's important to actually develop systems that can trace this flow of information. The other problem is that information is not only textual. So there is a ton of research on NLP, natural language processing, and so on, which is extremely valuable. But actually nowadays, a lot of online hate and disinformation and whatnot is carried out by videos or images and so on. And so what we need to do is actually put together all the research in computer vision, other areas, as well as NLP and so on, to actually organically understand all these dynamics. And the bottom line is that there is anecdotal evidence, we've seen it in the last 4 or 5 years, that there are these polarized communities that are somewhat sitting at the periphery of the internet, that are sort of driving a lot of online culture, online hate, disinformation, conspiracy theories, all these kind of things. How can we actually measure this? And is this true or is this not true, right? So just a couple of examples of the type of work that I've been doing with my group. So one recent work, which is still work in progress, we've been looking at how news stories propagate across online services. So if you remember, these stories can be shared on multiple services, and it's possible that certain communities are actually driving the discussion on other communities. So there can be polarized communities that actually gather together to make a narrative go mainstream, and then this narrative suddenly starts becoming popular on Twitter, for example, or on Reddit. And then maybe it gets picked up by the New York Times or some very popular news outlet and so on. So what we did here, we basically developed this very complex data collection and processing infrastructure. So we collect data from a very large amount of outlets. We analyze over 1,000 news websites. So we collect all the news articles from these news websites, and then we look at how these news websites, links to these news websites were shared on different online communities. And we look at both mainstream online communities like Twitter and Reddit, as well as more polarized like 4chan and Gab, which they made the news to be essentially driving propaganda over the last few years. And overall, we collect basically 1.5 million news URLs, and we find 39 million instances of discussion on online services, various online services discussing these URLs. But then it's not as simple as that. So news URLs, news stories, news articles in general can be about the same story, okay? So what we want to do is actually grouping together articles that belong to the same story to understand how stories in general are being discussed. And to do that, we use an external dataset which is called GDELT, which is compiled by journalists and fact checkers and so on. And this basically tells us what kind of events are discussed in an article, and we use these to basically build graphs, so where articles are linked together when they're talking about the same thing. And then we use some clustering techniques to basically identify clusters of articles that are strongly connected, and we say these are about the same story. And once we have these, we can basically study how the story propagates across services. And in particular, we use this statistical technique called Hawk's processes, which basically tells us whether the occurrence of a new story on a certain platform is likely happening organically, so just people finding it and sharing it, or it's likely being pushed by someone else, by some other community that's actually trying to make it go viral. Okay, so this is the general framework. I won't go into too many details, but this is just to give you an idea. And what we find is that within these news stories, different communities are actually pushing different narratives on other social networks. So if you look at the immigration debate in 2017 and 18 on social networks, we find that if you look at Twitter, the most influential story, which this means the story that people were sharing that actually picked up on Twitter itself and other platforms, was just fairly generic. So, about the immigration ban and, airports being blocked and things like that. If you look at more polarized communities, so if you look at, for example, the Donald subreddit, which was, recently quarantined because of hate speech and a number of reasons, we find that these people were actually pushing stories which were somewhat misleading. So this is a BBC article, if I remember correctly, and the title actually does not exactly match whatever the article is saying, right? So it's saying that there is some evidence that some things happened, but this is actually used to push a narrative. If we look at 4chan, we actually see, again, clickbait type of articles, which are completely different, which are sort of misrepresenting what actually happened, right? So the Prime Minister of Mexico said something, and this was interpreted as Mexico agreed to pay for the wall, but this was not actually what was said, right? And this is made viral and so on. So these things can actually help us identify case studies and then go and maybe do some qualitative analysis, some deeper analysis of what's going on and what are the important narratives that we should focus on to better understand misinformation and disinformation. Another example, I told you that information is not only textual, so we need to understand images, okay? And in particular, a lot of internet culture is driven by memes. So there are these images that are changing, getting modified over time and so on. How do we make sense of them? It's challenging because it's not always the same images. They are evolving by definition, right? So what we did was actually developing an analysis pipeline that is using perceptual hashing, which is basically a technique that tells us if two images are somewhat similar but not the same. And if they are somewhat similar, we can actually group them together and then do something similar to what we did in the news case. Can we actually figure out which images are picking up and are becoming popular and so on? And this is just to give you an example of the kind of clusters that we find, right? So they're not the same image. At the center, there is the most representative meme, but then we see a lot of variations and evolutions and so on. If we find an influential meme that is being pushed by certain communities, then we can go and study it deeper. We can maybe apply computer vision and figure out who's in those images and what are the most popular characters and why are they, how are they portrayed and so on and so forth. And we can also figure out, are these benign images, maybe they are hateful, maybe they are racist and whatnot. And you see a variety of things going on here. And what we found is that on different social networks, there are different types of memes. So some of them are political, some of them are clearly racist, some of them are used as dog whistles and things like that. But this is sort of a foundation to actually go and analyze these things deeper. And yeah, this is what I wanted to cover. Yeah, perfectly on time. Thank you. All right, our next speaker is Jessica Stern. She's a research professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies. Please.
Hi, it's so wonderful to be here. I work on terrorism. I've been working on terrorism since the late 1980s when it was a totally eccentric topic. It obviously became more important over time. And what's happened in my world, in the world of terrorism and hate crime, is that a lot of activity has moved online. And I wanted to see if we could develop a course where students get to work on measuring some of the dangerous speech, hate speech and dangerous speech online. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the course. We ran a pilot, and I was able to work. I was very fortunate that I got to work with Ziba Cranmer at BU Spark. We had a number of students making sure that the course would be feasible. We ran the pilot actually for about 6 months, and for reasons that will become clear, I had to work with BU's attorney. I had to work with the cyber law clinic and the IRB to make sure that we were going to be able to do this both legally and safely. We had an external partner, which is the Anti-Defamation League. And in the course, we had 4 student projects. As we continue with this course, I hope to continue with it, we will have other clients, we hope. The Anti-Defamation League was very, very excited about students getting involved in this kind of activity, trying to measure what's going on online. In the course, we had 4 teams. Team 1 was able to monitor Telegram channels. Those channels actually had been identified for us just as 8chan was going down. I'm sure you all know that 8chan was taken down after the El Paso attack, the white nationalist attack that happened late this summer. And the students were able to monitor, at the request of the Anti-Defamation League, some particular dates. Did anything change on particular dates? For example, the anniversary of Kristallnacht. The Anti-Defamation League actually gave us a list of dates to monitor. And they collected channel characteristics in order to share them with the Anti-Defamation League. In the second team, we got explicit permission for the students to create sock puppet accounts. This is something, the legality is not entirely clear because of the terms of service for many of these sites do not allow the creation of sock puppet accounts, and actually also in many cases do not allow scraping. We decided to work with the attorney for a site that many of you are familiar with. That attorney was so excited about students getting involved in this project that he came all the way from California to come speak to our students, and told me afterwards he hopes that to be able to hire some of our students. The students did find something pretty shocking, which was a game that was created so that participants could pretend to be school shooters, and also mass shooting, to follow mass shooters. As you know, some of the recent terrorist attacks carried out by white nationalists were filmed and by the perpetrator, and the students did discover that there was a game created so that participants could mimic what had actually happened in really horrific terrorist crimes. One of our students had acquired 3 years of content from Gab. Actually, Professor Stringini alerted us to the availability of this pre-scraped data, which was great because of the problem of scraping data potentially in violation of the terms of service. And this was a one-woman team, actually, a student who's a computer science student as well as a student in my school, which is the Pardee School of Global Studies, Sarah Kim. She got some help from a number of computer science faculty and actually some of her fellow BU Spark members, and was able to clean up these data. And I can tell you that the Anti-Defamation League was very pleased to get these data. The last team decided two students who actually may go on to law school, were thinking that they will go on to law school, and it's looking like they will, actually, decided to study the legal aspects of scraping and creating sock puppet accounts, and the fact that researchers are potentially liable under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So it's kind of scary for research faculty who want to do this kind of work. And there is a case that was brought actually before the Attorney General, now William Barr, that aims to clarify the law. And these students organized a panel to discuss the case. Going forward, we're hoping to continue the partnership with the Anti-Defamation League. Actually, they've already said they're very excited about doing that. And my goal, together with Professor Stringini, is to raise some money so that we can have computer science doctoral students involved both in the course and to continue the work for the Anti-Defamation League or other external partners who are interested in this. I hope to be able to create a cross-college challenge course. I hope eventually to be able to get Professor Stringini or some other faculty more closely involved in the course, with the aim over the long term of creating a national competition. And I will stop there. Thank you.
All right, our next speaker is Chris Wells. He's an assistant professor in emerging media studies.
Please. Thank you. I guess I should have made my affiliation a little more clear. I'm in the Department of Journalism in the College of Communication and the Division of Emerging Media Studies, which is our PhD program in communication. And I'm presenting work that is a part of a larger project. This particular analysis has been led by my student, Yini Zhang, at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. So let me start by saying a little bit about my general orientation to research in the College of Communication. As a scholar of political communication, I'm really interested in the complex media system and its interactions. So that includes some of the disinformation that happens on the periphery of our information system, but also interactions between the mainstream news media, journalistic organizations, social media publics, politicians, and other entities like that. So this is a part of that analysis, looking at some of the accounts that were active during 2016, 2017, that we now know were controlled by Russia's Internet Research Agency as part of a disinformation warfare campaign against the United States. So if you're not familiar with this campaign, here's a little quote from the Muller Report, which came out in March. He was describing that dozens of IRA employees, so employees of Russia's information apparatus, were operating fake accounts that purported to be American citizens on most of the major social media platforms, including Twitter and Facebook. And I'll be looking at a couple of the ones that were active on Twitter today. But this fits into a bigger, well, let me show you them really quickly. On your left is so-called Crystal Johnson, who was appeared to be a young woman from the United States who leaned left. You can see her image appears to be African-American, and she promoted a lot of left-leaning causes such as Black Lives Matter in her activities. On the right, you have the account 10GOP, which appears to have something to do with Tennessee and the Republican Party, and naturally promoted conservative causes and was far and away the most successful of the IRA accounts on Twitter in terms of number of followers and retweets and all of those kinds of of metrics. Here you can see the growth in their follower count, which is going to be the main topic of my analysis here, over the course of time. So you can see from the beginning of 2016, when they had sort of few followers, they gained tens of thousands, and in the case of 10GOP, hundreds of thousands of followers over the course of the campaign and the period of Trump's inauguration. Let me say a few things about how this fits into my broader project of studying the media system, and then I'll show you some specific analyses of how they succeeded in building these audiences that were made up mostly of genuine Twitter accounts. These were not mostly bots or troll accounts that were following them. So here's where I come from a conceptual point of view. We're interested in the study of attention. Our media system runs on human attention. It has actually for a very long time, since advertising became the basis of media production in the United States. Media had to attract audiences' attention in order to lease it to advertisers. This is simply how the whole system works. With the digital economy and digitization, we are increasingly aware that attention is both scarce and fleeting. There's too much information for us to attend to. And not only that, but actors have to reproduce our attention over time. Social media audiences are a way to do this. These are essentially structures that fix attention over time. So they give an actor a ready-made audience for direct communications. Furthermore, having an audience now provides a heuristic. There's a socio-technical aspect to this, which is that having an audience, in the case of 10GOP, hundreds of thousands of followers, becomes a heuristic for other users of social media, suggesting or implying credibility and relevance to others. This includes both citizens and also news media. Increasingly, research is coming out of journalism studies suggesting that news media play a very great deal of attention to these kinds of metrics in terms of deciding what they then cover in the New York Times or Slate or Rolling Stone or someplace else. So this has a pan-media type of effect in line with what Gianluca was mentioning in terms of cross-platform flows of information. So we're taking kind of this ecological approach to disinformation. Actually, echoing what Gianluca just said, these disinformation campaigns do not operate in a vacuum, but intersect with and attempt to leverage the very features of the media systems that they inject themselves into. So this encourages us to ask what disinformation campaigns do, but also how their behaviors and their success is dependent on these kinds of interactions. So we're asking in this study what factors contributed to the development of those audiences, which later in the campaign, those audiences were leveraged in terms of portraying credibility and relevance to other kinds of publics. We're going to focus on the network dynamics around these actors' behaviors on Twitter. We're going to look at the role of high-profile accounts. It will turn out to be especially high-profile accounts from the extreme right and alt-right, so genuine accounts, but fairly extremist politically accounts that were interacting with these trolls' messages. And then finally, the role of media outlets in further disseminating them. Here's what our analysis looked like to give you a picture of the kind of data we're working with. It becomes a time series on the daily basis of about 600 days. We're drawing, in this case, Twitter data from a 1% of global Twitter archive. Our criterion variable will be daily change in the follower sizes of these accounts, so how many followers they had on every day. We're going to look at retweets of them, and we're going to look at the size of the audiences of those retweeting the accounts. Then we drew from Media Cloud daily mentions of the accounts by left-leaning outlets, right-leaning outlets, and mainstream or centrist news media outlets. So one of the things that was interesting about these troll accounts is they actually got mentioned a fair number of times in news media, in the Washington Post, in many other kinds of outlets. So in that way, they were often drawn on as examples of either extremist speech or just to represent public opinion on Twitter. We can collect those and include those in our model as likely predictors of follower growth. Here's the kind of approach that we're taking. We're using time series approaches using vector autoregression with Granger causality analysis. So for us, these are fairly straightforward time series approaches. We are interested in collaborating with others who have greater sophistication in these kinds of areas to get a clearer picture of the kinds of dynamics among these different entities. But this is basically what I'm going to be showing you today. Okay, I have greatly distilled our Granger causality tables. You won't have to look at any numbers. You're just going to see where we saw significant effects. So you can see we've got in the columns the two accounts whose follower counts we are modeling, and on the left side the criteria, the independent variables that we're trying to understand. We saw strong network effects in terms of predicting the follower counts for both accounts. This is not surprising at all. We know from lots of past research that building a following is dependent on getting response. If you get retweeted, new people are going to see your account and they can then follow you. Not only that, but the size of the audiences of the people retweeting you is important. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but getting very prominent people to retweet you is very helpful because, of course, then it's a greater number of people that your message is being spread to. The effects for media mentions were much sparser. It was 10 GOP that gained significant new following by being mentioned in the news media. So in this case, if the Washington Post mentions 10 GOP, which it did a handful of times, 10 GOP is gaining new followers. So this is another channel for the dissemination of, in this case, a disinformation campaign. We found an interesting effect with right-wing media mentions. Mentions of 10 GOP by the right-wing media did not have a direct effect on 10 GOP's own follower count. However, right-wing mentions of 10 GOP did seem to precede mentions of 10 GOP in the mainstream media. So there's some indication that the media themselves are looking to one another to detect who is newsworthy and should be included in further coverage, or who should just be kept an eye on and maybe eventually mentioned. I want to go back to that key finding about the size of retweeters' follower accounts. This is a study by a journalist, by Luke O'Brien at Huffington Post, although we've looked in our data and found some similar things, that looks at interactions between 10 GOP, that particular purportedly conservative account, and prominent figures in the alt-right, far-right during 2016. And you can see on the left side of this chart in the green the number of times those right-wing figures retweeted 10 GOP. And you can see that there's a very significant number of those. So Mike Cernovich, you can see a prominent alt-right figure, retweeted 10 GOP 24 times. And you can see others, and this list goes down. It's cut off, but it goes down quite a ways. So what we're seeing here is that 10 GOP, or the disinformation campaign in general, cannot be extracted from the wider media system. These are legitimate political actors and political speakers. It's known who they are. They are alt-right, fairly extreme politically figures, but they are not disinformation campaigns in terms of purporting to be somebody that they're not. So here we see that 10 GOP is tightly integrated within that group. They are part of that conversation, suggesting that it's hard to disentangle the disinformation campaign from the partisan discourse of our media system. A couple conclusions. We're talking about interconnectedness of our social media system, which corresponds to other results in this research program. The personas of these Russian trolls were constructed over time in concert with other parts of the media system. They weren't on their own in building their audiences, but they could depend on other parts of the existing media system for their benefit. Mainstream media and conservative media interacted in drawing new attention and followers. And it's clear that the far-right and the alt-right played a unique role in amplifying 10 GOP's persona, further driving its audience growth. We did not see any parallel effects like this for Crystal Johnson, who just overall was not nearly as successful in terms of gaining followers or appearing in news media. We are urging increased attention to the ecologies in which disinformation campaigns exist, and I'd be eager to talk to others who are interested in pursuing this line of research. Thank you.
All right, our last speaker is Wesley Wildman. He's a professor of philosophy, theology, and ethics in the School of Theology.
Hello everyone and welcome. That photograph there reminds me of my relatives who are battling fires in Australia at the moment. Some of them not so successfully, some of them with great heroism, fighting back the fires and saving their farms. But the point of it is something completely different. It's to indicate that the problem of the sexual exploitation of children, though an ancient one, has become massively more complicated, exacerbated by online tools. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. I think we need to face the fact that our values are somehow twisted around this issue. We really want to raise carefree children, but in fact, we need to train children to beware. And what we really need to be doing, I think, is focusing on punishing, re-educating and training people as required in order to protect themselves from what's becoming a large industry that can be measured in the following way. This is just in the United States. Do the math with me. There's about 100 million men who are sexually active in the United States. About 20% of them are going to pay for sex at some point in their lives. A quarter of them are high-frequency buyers, accounting for about 75% of the market. And 47%, almost half of those high-frequency buyers, when given information that the person they're trying to buy sex from is in fact a minor, will continue with the transaction, which is valued at around about $150 a pop and about 8 times a year. It produces an estimate of a market like this. This is what's driving the problem of the sexual exploitation of minors in the United States. It's a demand problem. Very difficult to address the demand problem. Now, online activity is what's creating a space for this demand to grow. And I think there are about 7 dimensions of it. There may be others, but it stretches from grooming victims to controlling and monitoring victims to connecting supply with demand and then monitoring traffickers. You have to remember that traffickers need to be recruited as well, and they need to be controlled and monitored too. And then there's the possibility of escaping the life, raising awareness in the general public, and intervening more effectively and more efficiently. I'll say a word about each of these. First, online impact. In 2015, over half of the people, 98% girls, by the way, who were exploited in the commercial sex industry, met their traffickers first online. You just read that narrative there, you'll see how easy it is for traffickers to connect up with people online in a way that formerly was impossible. Predators are looking for indications of substance abuse, runaway activity, destabilization with the home, sadness, depression, desperation to get out of wherever they are and go somewhere else. And they can find that stuff in all kinds of social media outlets. There's also the issue of controlling victims. Look at that third one. I was in emotionally and physically abusive relationship, but felt a strong love despite the abuse. This is fairly typical. These people feel bonded to their traffickers, feel bonded especially because the traffickers are providing shelter and food and protection. But those relationships critically involve emotional manipulation. So if you add emotional manipulation to abuse, which is very common in these relationships as that graph shows, and then throw in online monitoring so that you don't have as much freedom as you might like to find alternative sources of information or to reach out for help, then you're controlled. The online monitoring is a critical part of this nexus of control. On the third issue, connecting supply and demand, online advertising has become much more common than street advertising in this industry. And it also increases sales quite markedly. So it follows that it's more efficient and more effective to use online advertising and that you can massively amplify the market, connecting supply to demand in a way that was more difficult in the past. Then there's the thing I mentioned about traffickers. Traffickers themselves need to be recruited. They need to be groomed. And in the process, they need to adapt their moral system in such a way that they can picture themselves working with children in this way. And some traffickers are actually opposed to that at the start. But they can be coerced and monitored and compelled in such a way that they become more open to that and eventually accept that as normal, with a variety of different kinds of rationalizations. These rationalizations are important. They're stories that traffickers tell themselves about why what they're doing is okay, why it's okay to call it a victimless crime, which is their normal way of thinking about it. A lot more research is needed on trafficker recruitment. And what about escaping the life? Not everyone has a trafficker, but even those who don't have traffickers, who are in the life, maybe it's webcams or something else, 72% of them in this particular time slice actually wanted help at some point. They wanted a way out, but they didn't know how to get out. And if they had a trafficker, that number was much higher. So there's, what's interesting about this is that you get used to a life, and it's difficult to leave, even if that life is painful, because the alternative is difficult to conceive. Now, it's become more frequent for traffickers not to control their victims as closely. It's turned, over time, the traffickers have learned that they can be more effectively control their people if they allow just a little bit of freedom. And that little bit of freedom shows up in less online monitoring of, say, texts and emails and web use now than was the case about 10 years ago. And because the monitoring is decreasing, that means that the main opportunity for reaching people is also online. That's the better way for people to encounter information about alternatives. Now then there's raising awareness. There's lots of people talking about trafficking. Some of it's accurate, some of it's not. For example, it's quite common to hear that trafficking is something that just happens overseas, or it's tied to human trafficking across borders, but child sex trafficking is local, it's everywhere. It's possible to do online distribution of training materials so that kids can find this stuff before they get into trouble. The Little Red film, look it up. It's an amazing animated film that's doing a good job of working with little kids and raising consciousness. And finally, intervening effectively. Our group produced the top 40 tech tools to combat child trafficking, which is a white paper that found its way into Trafficking Matters and then ultimately into a 2019 counter-trafficking summit at the White House. This particular document produces 5 classifications of reviewed products, all of the digital kind, that are being used at the moment to try and intervene. Now, on that, I want to add one other twist to this, which has to do with policy simulation. This is a new type, not so new, but and as applied to policy, relatively new type of computational method that creates artificial societies that can be a platform for virtual experimentation. This allows you to test policies before you invest in them, which is the same thing you do with a bridge or a roller coaster or a distribution system or anything else. We should be doing that with policy as well. The policy simulation critically involves looking at a social system and accepting the fact that we're going to need to hear from psychologists and evolutionary biologists and neurologists and medical people and anthropologists and sociologists and economists and demographers. Everyone's got something to say about almost any complicated social issue. Notice how much this totally ignores university disciplinary distinctions. This is all about problem-focused research. You've got to pull together the disciplines necessary to generate the information that you need. And when you do that, you can uncover the causal architecture of a complex system. And how does one of these models work? You build a virtual mind. This virtual mind gets put into a computer agent. Relationships between those agents are established, and all of that's validated using real-world data from social psychology. There's emergent features that come when these agents interact with one another, which produces simulation results, which are in turn validated against real-world data. If you've got a valid model in this sense, then what you've produced is an experimental platform. And this experimental platform benefits from expert feedback and can be used to experiment on policy options. That's an agent-based model or a multi-agent artificial intelligence model. It's a critical tool for social policy simulation, and here's a proof of concept. King County, which is the county containing Washington, Seattle, in the state of Washington, has a very large sex trafficking market. We created a model, policy simulation, which enabled us to test a shift in policies. Prosecuting on the demand side was the new idea, replacing the idea of prosecuting on the supply side, that is, prosecuting kids for being prostitutes, so-called. So this switch in policy is a very interesting move, morally, I think, a good move, and the effect of it is a prediction that you actually drive down slightly the demand for recruitment of girls into the commercial sex industry. That's just appeared, that paper. It's a proof of concept, specifically in the sense that it shows that this type of modelling can be used to evaluate policies. We've got several new simulations in the work in this area, one focusing on traffickers, another focusing on the grooming process, and a third on the moral reasoning of and behaviour of johns or purchasers of sex from children. And in all of these cases, we're talking about online processes being critical adjuncts to the way these operations work. So we're looking at the spread of values, the spread of ideas, the spread of market opportunities, all of which we can represent in these models using something like epidemiology. It's called the epidemiology of representations, and it allows us to talk about the spread of ideas. But the point overall is to test before you invest. This work is being done in the Centre for Mind and Culture, which, though independent, was founded by and run by Boston University faculty, and there's lots of students in there as well. We're literally right across the road here. And though I'm a professor in the School of Theology, and I'm honoured to be that, I'm also very pleased to be involved in the data science process here in the university. This is a reminder that humanities scholars like me, I'm a philosopher, have a role in data science. We can do meaningful work, and it's our privilege to be working with you on problems like this in an attempt to make the world better. Thank you.
All right. So yeah, thanks for coming and presenting. I think you painted a nice picture of how data science can actually tap into different problems to help, both measuring and modeling and possibly identifying solutions to the problem. I'm wondering, so what is the main challenge you see in actually combining, whatever your field of research is with data science? Can we just go around maybe?
Just very briefly, there's two big problems we face. The first is getting data on, in this project, for example, an illegal industry. It's quite difficult to estimate it, to get data on it, to figure out how ideas spread. That's the first thing. The second thing is getting buy-in from policy experts. We found from previous experiments that you can't produce something, take it to policy people and expect them to be interested in it. That does not work. You have to bring policy people in right at the start and get them involved in building these models. That does work, but even though it works, it doesn't mean that your great creations have a tremendous amount of penetration. So that's an ongoing challenge for us.
Yeah, I would say our problem is not getting the data. We're swimming in data. But figuring out what is in it is a bigger problem. So these are, as you well know, Gianluca, these are complex systems in which there are a lot of actors who are working on particular political issues or spreading disinformation. And detecting which one might be influencing others is extremely difficult, especially when you have external events that are happening that all of them are responding to at the same time. So this is where we're trying to work with time series analysis to try to suss out even very small increments of time difference between when certain kinds of messages are distributed by certain actors. But I would say that's the biggest problem that we're running up against, which is kind of the classic social science problem of causality.
So I first want to say this was an incredible panel. Thank you so much. It was so interesting. I was really surprised by what I heard this morning. My challenge so far is that I haven't had a lot of computer science students joining in with us, and I just want to encourage computer science students. This is an opportunity to be involved in a real-world problem and actually do something to make the world a better place, a safer place. And so I'm really hoping that we'll be attracting more of you over time.
Okay, so from my point of view, so I come more from the computational side. So, you know, I do the computer science bit here. So the challenges I see are, well, there are a number of them. The first one is that, you know, as computer scientists, we are not trained in any of these disciplines. So, you know, I don't know much about criminology, sociology, psychology, and whatnot. So sometimes it's difficult to interpret whatever these models are telling us, and it's also we also incur the risk of, you know, reinventing the wheel, or, you know, just going down the wrong road and whatever. So this is why it is actually important to collaborate with people from other disciplines to actually, as I said in my talk, you know, to check whether, you know, theories from other fields actually match whatever we find, or we can find, you know, evidence of them, or maybe show that they don't apply. And another big problem is that there can be a disconnect between the online world and the physical world. So a lot of these research, so we can find, you know, how much content was reshared by, you know, Russian trolls or whatever, but did that actually have an effect on the real world? Did that change anybody's opinion? Or, you know, was it just online activity that in the end it somehow didn't matter? The same thing goes with cybercrime. You know, we find you know, fraudulent posts, we find you know, schemes going on and so on. What is actually the conversion behind it? So are we measuring the right thing? Are we measuring something that matters and so on? And so these models that I presented allow us to find somewhat influential campaigns, but only in the online realm. We have no way of actually matching them to you know, what's going on in the real world. And for that, we will need to, you know, possibly interview people, or, you know, do something else that, you know, can actually give us a view on that.
Question?
Yeah.
Of the panel, yeah. I'm quite interested to know how you go from describing the data, which Chris and Gianluca did especially, I think. You described complex data, to figuring out meaningful interventions so that you can, for example, diagnose or figure out what to focus on so that you can diagnose trolls faster, or produce countervailing messages, or help Facebook or whatever block accounts. What practical steps does this type of analysis yield?
I can answer one aspect of that. So as I mentioned, in 2016, there was a great deal of interaction actually between these disinformation accounts as well as just accounts on the extremes of the political spectrum and the news media. So we've done some reports and interventions in the sense of better informing journalists about what practices they can engage in to verify the accounts that they're talking about. I think we see in this study that when they write about these accounts, even if it is to represent a view as extreme, they are promoting it in the sense of amplifying it and sending it to new folks who might, some of whom might then go and follow the account. So I think educating journalists who are still in a sense, they're not gatekeepers, but they still play an important role in the flow of information is one way that we've gone about that.
In the form of a white paper or something?
Yeah, in the form of white papers, in the form of publications in industry publications. So Columbia Journalism Review is a place that kind of meets the academy and journalism in the sense that a lot of academic research is written up in a shorter, accessible form there, and journalists read it, or hopefully read it.
Okay. Yeah, so it really depends on the problem. So I find that for some of these problems like disinformation and online hate and so on, we are not yet at the point in which we can come up with countermeasures. We don't really understand the problem very well yet. So this is what, you know, I've been focusing on mostly. When it comes to actually finding countermeasures, I'm not sure that computer scientists are the best people to actually design these countermeasures. I come from computer security, and our approach has always been just anything that's bad, just delete it, block it, whatever. So I used to work. I'm still working on malware detection and cybercrime detection, like fraud detection and things like that. It does work, just blocking malicious content and so on, but there can be unexpected consequences. So typically the criminals can move somewhere else. That makes it more difficult to actually monitor them and figure out what's going on and so on. So here I tried working with criminologists, actually, and trying to apply techniques from environmental criminology to cybercrime. So can we actually figure out what the effect of a countermeasure would be? Would the criminal move, and where would they move? Just one second. The problem is that environmental criminology focuses on physical crime. So typically, if somebody is making burglaries in a neighborhood, and the police are patrolling that neighborhood, they will just move to the next neighborhood. On the internet, all these bets are off because they can move wherever. So this is a big challenge that we've been encountering.
Actually, I'll just add one point. It is true that when accounts are deleted, when dangerous speaking accounts are deleted, they're often moving to other places where the followers are more extreme. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London did an experiment trying to develop countermeasures and found that individuals speaking to other individuals, not a counter message online, but actually an individual conversation, was possibly more effective than just responding with counter messaging in a conversation online, an open conversation online.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, definitely. I think that most of the research happening in computer security measurement, social networks, and whatnot is mostly looking at is mostly using observational data. So we are collecting a lot of data, and we can potentially build models to predict what's going to happen based on what happened before, but we don't have a good way to actually factor in interventions. So we could model, how do disinformation campaigns work, and use that to predict future disinformation campaigns. So given a new conspiracy theory coming out, will that pick up or not? So that's something that we can currently do. We haven't really applied these simulation models to actually factor in external events, which I think would be extremely interesting to actually do. Yeah.
One of my groups does work of Jessica's kind, looking at violent extremist groups and trying to figure out the conditions under which they're likely to thrive and not thrive, again, using simulation methods. And we've talked over email about some of that before, but it's very interesting to see that you can get quite unexpected predictions. That is, the system that you analyze can produce insights that you're not ready for. One of the criteria that one of the strategies for blocking the development of violent religious extremists turned out to function as an assassination criteria for targeted attacks, which is not something that was on our radar at all as a research topic, and yet it came dropping out of the model in a way that was more or less hard to resist. And I assume predictive tools of that kind exist in the private government side of research that we don't see in the public areas, and they use that to decide whether it's worth taking someone out or not. But it was really alarming to discover this popping up. So my point here is just to notice that you're not just predicting things under your own control, you're generating insights that produce novel ideas that you might not have been able to think of otherwise.
Yes, please.
So the question is about any tools that you build. Isn't there an incentive for the platforms that people are exchanging these messages on, like Facebook or Instagram or wherever they're doing this? Isn't there an incentive for these companies to collaborate with you and give you the ability to scrape the data or give you the data so that those platforms can be don't have this type of behavior, and have we approached the industry to look at this?
From evidence, the answer seems to be no. They don't have a lot of incentive. I can describe a little bit the collaborations that communication researchers have tried to do with Facebook. Following the 2016 campaign, a consortium was set up led by Gary King at Harvard and Nate Parsley at Stanford. And the idea was that researchers could submit grant proposals to Facebook and propose to use Facebook data in a certain way. And Facebook would kind of cut out the data that person needed and give it to them so they could do this kind of independent research. And sometimes they offered some grants, too, to pay for research assistants and so forth. This program was inaugurated 2 years ago, and virtually nothing has happened. Facebook has claimed that it is too difficult for them to properly anonymize data and protect privacy. But the reality seems to be that they have little incentive to invest in it. And I think they are a bit concerned about having outside researchers raise issues with the platform that aren't already on the public agenda. To add one more piece, I think that these platforms certainly want to keep as much information in-house as they can. They don't want to share what might be trade secrets or what might become a scandal. And in some ways, the platforms benefit from this kind of behavior, because having extremist groups operating on your site is a way of keeping very engaged individuals on your site who are clicking on a lot of videos or a lot of posts and generating a lot of advertising money. So I think there's a number of reasons for these platforms not to cooperate with independent research, and perhaps fewer reasons to cooperate than you might think.
So I would add that what I know of is that Facebook is funding individual researchers. I believe you were funded. You received a grant. But they do have professional content moderators, and they're, for the most part, as you may know, treating them pretty badly. And some of them are now suing because they're getting post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the things I did in my class is I made sure that we were monitoring each other's moods. I didn't allow students to work alone on this material. I encouraged them to work only for short periods. Some students get really excited and really want to work very hard and ignore other aspects of their lives because they get too excited. So that was one of the things that I was watching. And I didn't mention that a few of the students love this work so much that they're now establishing with BU Innovate a company to keep doing the work. But we're also in that effort. It's not going to be a for-profit company, but that's at least certainly not for now. We are incorporating the sort of psychological well-being that we did in the class. And I can also say that both Facebook and DigitalOcean have asked me to speak to content moderators, because I've been exposed to this kind of material for so long, how to stay psychologically healthy while doing it. I think the way content moderation works will change over time, as the platforms recognize how difficult this is for the moderators.
Yeah.
Just on that, I know Facebook's hired one of our researchers who's working not as a content moderator, but as a researcher in-house. And I think they like that better because it's easier to control. It's public funding outside that could raise new issues that troubles them, but inside they're more willing to invest funds. So I think maybe they're taking it in-house and keeping it quiet.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so from my experience, so I got funding from both Google and Facebook. But generally speaking, so they're very willing to fund whatever work doesn't require user data. So they will, it's very hard for them to give you any user data, which, in this case would be a big problem. So the kind of work I've been doing, funded by them was mostly cybercrime related. So we were creating fake accounts on Google, on Facebook and whatnot. They helped with creation of these accounts. They helped figuring out, making sure that these accounts were disconnected from the rest of Facebook so that, they couldn't harm people and so on. And then we would basically study how criminals were interacting with them. But it was sort of a, sandboxed environment and so on. They are usually willing to act upon whatever you find. So together with Twitter, we've been working on shutting down spam accounts for the longest time and so on. So, if you externally find whatever and then tell them, they're happy to, give you some more insights and shutting these accounts down and all of that. But getting more data than you are supposed to with, public APIs and so on, it's very difficult. Yeah.
Hi, this is a great discussion. I'm a professor in the psychology department, and one of the things, so a lot of things you're talking about, I'm like, we could help. But one thing that stood out to me, or just a question I have for all of you, is that all of these interactions involve human beings and live social data. How do you manage, cover this under the Ethics Review Board of Boston University?
The data are de-identified by its very nature, so that's the first answer.
But that's just the beginning of a very knotty problem. Our group, working with some engineering groups, are at the forefront of trying to create a stable, ongoing discussion about ethics in the computer simulation world. Everything goes from ethical evaluation of algorithms that are capable of being biased and very difficult to diagnose to the deployment of insight-generating tools of the kind that I was talking about. They're equal opportunity tools. Anyone can use them. You can use them for good or for evil, for example. And so then the question becomes, how do you, if you're a researcher, how do you take responsibility for the fact that a tool that you develop could be used for ill? Should there be algorithm evaluating and tech evaluation and data science evaluation systems on the ethical front, much like we have human subjects review already in the university? So this is the kinds of discussions that are happening in the computer simulation world at the moment, and it's likely to be going on for quite some time. Most people in those worlds are techies. They don't think about ethics. They don't think about people even. And so it's very important, I think, for humanities scholars and social scientists and human scientists like yourself to get involved in these discussions, to force the issue so that people realize there are actual human lives at stake, human well-being at stake.
Shameless plug. Some of you have seen this thing on your seat in a couple of months. Actually less than a month. The symposium on bias and AI is actually sponsored by the Facebook, but also what's beyond. When there's a question about even the current processes we have, are they the right processes to measure ethics? I think it's very time and
Yeah, so I think there is a debate on whether you know, some of this research even qualifies as human subjects research or not. So if you're looking at data published in a public place without interacting with it and so on, some places will tell you it is human subjects research, some places will tell you it's not. Regardless, there are ethical considerations to be taken into account, right? So, you know, how do you treat the data? Do you try and go and anonymize people? Do you trace them? Do you, whatever you develop could have, you know, harmful consequences and so on. So I think there is no 100% answer on, you know, what is the right process there. And it's something that, you know, IRBs and so on are still figuring out.
Yeah, I would add that it's clear that IRBs are not dealing with the universe of ethical questions, and that includes even the kind of qualitative research I do, where I may be studying an individual who wants to be identified, and ethical problems do arise even though it's not considered research from the IRB perspective. What I've done so far is I try to get the IRB to consider those ethical questions that aren't really in their purview. I've also consulted the Office of Legal Counsel, but this is a genuine issue. I mean, sometimes researchers really do want advice about ethical questions that aren't organically addressed.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. I would add just a couple of points of reference to that as well. Similar to what Gianluca said, we've considered Twitter to be a public platform in which messages are disseminated publicly. But I think that can be a little bit deceptive. Users might not consider all of their statements to be necessarily public. It's kind of quasi-public in a lot of ways. So we take additional steps not to identify people who aren't already public figures or who aren't already making public statements. But another area where this gets very thorny is in experiments. We now have in communication people doing experiments on social media and Twitter and Facebook in which they do interact with users who have not consented to be part of research, which in my view does violate one of our fundamental tenets that people have a choice about whether to be research subjects. The argument made is that in these platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, those platforms are experimenting so routinely on their users without their consent that it is an inherent part of participation in those platforms. I don't think that aligns with users' general instincts for what they're doing on those platforms. But in any case, there's a lot, echoing Azra, there's a lot of rethinking that needs to happen when we consider this space.
Hi, thank you for the talks. I was wondering if you've had any success stories influencing policymakers to do the right thing when there are clear results. So like with SESTA FOSTA, the passing of that has clearly had a huge impact on increasing human trafficking because it's driven sex work underground. I was wondering if you've had any success stories or anything you could share about actually once you have that very clear result, how to make people actually pay attention. Thank you.
Yes, we call that the big win, and to us it occurs when policymakers change the way they argue because of an insight generated from a computational simulation. We're waiting for this to happen and pushing it. An example would be this. There are some states in this country that that refuse to consider underage children involved in the commercial sex industry as anything other than prostitutes, despite the fact that in federal law that's not possible. This they do for moral reason, and it's very difficult for them to be dislodged from that moral perspective. A moral fight is difficult to resolve. And yet the sorts of insights we've generated from that model suggest that you actually decrease the rate of recruitment of children into the commercial sex industry if you change your policies and don't prosecute children but prosecute buyers of sex instead and their traffickers. That shift in policy produces an outcome that's 100% agreeable. Everyone wants to have fewer kids trafficked, even places that want to consider them prostitutes when they are trafficked. We have not yet seen anyone pick up that argument, but we are pushing the argument and trying to inspire people in places where they need an extra argument to make the case to shift to demand-side prosecution instead of supply-side. And as soon as that win occurs, you can be sure that the Centre for Mind and Culture will be pushing that in its media apparatus.
I guess one other thing I would say is that policy is one avenue, but from our perspective in the complex media system, there's a lot of actors who may have policies on their own. Platforms have policies, there's governmental policy. Our one receptive audience for us has been journalists who are in the process of struggling to rethink their role in the media system. So just to have an audience with them is maybe a little helpful for us.
Yeah, so many of these things can, online services and companies can actually act upon to some extent. From the policy point of view, so some of the things I've done ended up on parliamentary record in the EU, in the UK, and so on. So politicians are listening. They're not necessarily acting upon this yet, but there is hope. Okay, so we're out of time, so thank you, and now we have a break.